The wind over Red Hollow did not just blow through the town. It judged it. It slid between wooden storefronts, rattled loose shutters, and carried with it the smell of dry earth and forgotten promises, as if the land itself remembered every cruelty ever spoken here. And beneath that endless, indifferent sky stood a woman the town had already decided to erase. If you're new here, subscribe to the channel and tap the bell icon. Stories like this deserve to be remembered. Clara Whitmore stood behind the worn wooden counter of her small sewing shop, her hands still, her posture straight. At 38, she had become something the town of Red Hollow spoke about. In lowered voices, too old to marry, too proud to pity, too visible to ignore completely. Once she had been called beautiful. Now she was called left behind. But Clara did not flinch at names anymore. Outside, horses clattered past in the dusty street. Laughter from younger women drifted in like sharpened glass. Someone laughed too loudly, deliberately so Clara could hear it. Still waiting for a husband. Miss Whitmore, one voice called from outside, sweetened with cruelty. Clara's needle paused, not because it hurt her, but because she measured it like she measured everything now. A slow breath and a controlled release. Out she returned to her stitching years ago. She had buried her father through a winter that refused mercy. After that, her siblings left one by one, chasing railroads west and futures that never wrote back. What remained of her life was thread, fabric and silence and survival. Beneath the counter, hidden beneath folded cloth and ledger books, rested a small revolver not displayed, not threatened, just there like a truth the town refused to acknowledge. Red Hollow had taught her something simple. A woman alone is never just alone. She is examined, measured, reduced, and if she survives long enough, she becomes invisible. That night, the harvest dance gathered the town into the lantern-lit square. Music rose from a worn fiddle, uneven but alive. Men drank too much whiskey. Women wore dresses stitched with hope and competition. Clara did not attend, she never did anymore. But she heard it anyway, the laughter, the music, the sharp rise of voices carried through the open window of her shop, like a world she had been excluded from by design. A group of younger women passed outside her door. Their dresses shimmered in lantern light, their voices bright with careless confidence. She still thinks someone will come for her. One whispered who would. Another answered, and they laughed, not loudly, not openly, the kind of laughter meant to last longer in memory. Clara stood slowly, walked to the window, looked out without expression. She did not cry, she did not turn away. She simply watched them pass, as if observing something distant and irrelevant, like weather moving across a far horizon. Inside her chest, something old and aching tightened. Not grief recognition, because she had once been like them. Before responsibility aged her faster than time ever could. Before duty replaced desire. Before the world decided her worth had expired. A gust of wind slammed the shop door slightly open. And that was when the sound changed everything. Boots, not dancing, not light. Heavy boots on packed dirt. The kind of steps that did not ask permission from the ground. Clarinet, a man stood in the doorway of Red Hollow, like a memory that had forgotten how to leave Elijah Boone. Dust clung to his coat and shoulders, as if the desert had tried to keep him. His hat was low, shadowing eyes that had seen too much and refused to forget any of it. He did not smile. He did not announce himself. He simply observed the room, the way a man studies a battlefield. Before deciding where blood will fall, the town noticed him immediately. Of course they did. Men like Elijah were never ignored in places like Red Hollow. They were either respected or feared, sometimes both. He stepped inside the saloon across the street first, just long enough for the town to see him. Order nothing, speak little, and listen too much. That was enough to make people uneasy. Because silence in a violent land is never empty. It is waiting. Later that evening, the confrontation began the way most violence in the West begins. Overpride dressed as humor. Two railroad men drunk on cheap whiskey, and louder than their worth, stumbled into the saloon, where Clara had gone briefly to collect supplies for her shop. She did not seek attention. She never did. But attention found her anyway. "Look at her," one of them sneered, voice carrying, still standing like she's waiting to be chosen. The evil laughed, "Ain't nobody picking that over a 20-year-old blonde." The words spread through the room like oil on fire. Clara froze, but only for a heartbeat. Then she continued walking. That was one of why your bones stood up. The chair did not squeak dramatically. He did not shout. He simply rose. The room changed. His voice, when it came, was low enough to force silence rather than demand it. "You speak again," he said. "Eyes fixed on the men, and you'll learn what your tongue is worth." The railroad men laughed until they looked at him. Then they stopped, because violence is not always in action. Sometimes it is in restraint. One of them reached for his belt, half daring the world to become something worse. Elijah did not move quickly. He did not need to. His hand was already near his side, steady, controlled like a man who had once drawn a weapon. In storms of dust and screaming, the saloon held its breath. Clara stood near the counter watching, not frightened, studying him, because she recognized something in him she had never admitted existed in herself. A person carrying damage that never fully healed. The bartender whispered, "Boone, cavalry scout, ain't he?" A memory moved through the room like a shadow. Military service, frontier patrols. Stories no one liked to repeat. Elijah finally spoke again, quieter this time. Apologize. The word was not loud, but it was final. One of the men spat on the floor instead. That was their mistake. Elijah moved fast, precise. Controlled violence born not of rage, but discipline, a single motion. A shove, a disarm. The man hit the floor, hard enough to rattle the silence out of the room. No gunfire followed, only breathing heavy, uncertain, alive. Elijah stepped back immediately, as if disgusted by what he had to do rather than proud of it. And that is when Clara understood him. Not as a savior, not as a hero, but as a man trying, constantly trying not to become what the frontier had shaped him into. Their eyes met across the room. Not romantic, not soft, something sharper, recognition, the kind that comes when two people realize they have both been surviving the same kind of loneliness, in different shapes. The saloon door creaked open behind him, as if the town itself was uneasy with what it had witnessed. Elijah did not look back at the men he had silenced. He looked at Clara, and for the first time since entering Red Hollow, his expression softened not into kindness, but into understanding. Later that night, when the town had returned to pretending nothing important had happened, Clara stood alone outside her shop. The lantern above her door flickered in the wind. Footsteps approached, not rushed, not aggressive, controlled. Elijah Boone stopped a few feet away. For a long moment, neither spoke. The desert wind moved between them like something ancient listening. Then he said quietly, "They'll talk about you tomorrow." Clara replied without hesitation. "They always do." A pause, then Elijah nodded once, as if accepting something about who he had already suspected. "You shouldn't let them decide what you are for." I sharpened slightly, "And what do you think I am?" "Mr. Boone." He hesitated, not because he lacked an answer, but because he understood the weight of choosing one. Finally, someone still standing. Silence followed, not empty, heavy with possibility neither of them trusted yet. Then almost unexpectedly Elijah added, "Have dinner with me tomorrow." Nothing more than a meal. Clara studied him. Men did not offer kindness in Red Hollow, without expecting something in return. But there was no hunger in his gaze. Only something quieter or spent and something buried deeper or stowed. "I don't know you," she said. "I don't need to argue with Grimm. That's why it matters." He's right, though. The town continued its life laughing, judging, forgetting. But between Clara Whitmore and Elijah Booth, something small shifted, not long, not yet. But the first breaking consolation. It is Red Hall that was the beginning of everything dangerous. The quiver turned slightly toward the shop door, then stopped for a moment. She looked back at him. "Come on," she said. He watched him nod and walk, then stepped back into the darkness of the street, and he became the ghost of flickering lantern. For the first time in years, the world did not feel like the end of the world. We moved through Red Hawaii again, but now it feels like something different. Possibility, the possibility of the New West, was always the most dangerous thing in the world. A windless morning settled over the desert like a held breath, as if the land itself was waiting to see what kind of choice a broken man would make next. Far beyond Red Hollow, where the roads thinned into dust and silence swallowed distance, a ranch stood alone beneath a sky too wide for comfort, and inside that silence, a woman was being offered something she no longer trusted. If you're new here, subscribe to the channel and tap the bell icon. Stories like this deserve to be remembered. Clara Whitmore sat in the back of a rattling wagon. As it climbed the final ridge toward Elijah Boone's ranch, the wheels groaned under weight not of cargo, but of uncertainty. Her hands rested in her lap, calm on the surface but tightened beneath like coiled wire. She had learned long ago that kindness in this land rarely came without condition. Elijah rode beside the wagon, silent as always, his hat tilted low against the rising sun. Dust clung to his coat like memory that refused to wash away from others. When the ridge finally broke, the ranch revealed itself. A wide valley carved between mountain shoulders, fences stretching like pale scars across the land, wild horses moving in the distance like drifting ghosts of freedom. A barn half-shadowed, half-burnt from older seasons of violence that never fully healed. This was not a place of comfort, It was a place of survival pretending to be peace. Clara stepped down slowly when the wagon stopped. The ground felt unfamiliar beneath her boots, not because it was new, but because it felt like it belonged to someone who had stopped, asking permission from the world. Elijah watched her carefully, not like a man judging, like a man waiting to see if something fragile would choose to stay. "You'll manage the accounts," he said quietly. "Correspondence, supply records, whatever you see that needs fixing." Clara's eyes narrowed slightly. "That's not what most ranchers offer a woman they just met." A faint pause, Elijah replied. "Most ranchers don't care if their ranch survives the winter." There was no charm in his voice, only truth. That was the first crack in her resistance. Not attraction, not trust, but recognition that he was not performing. He meant every word he said. The ranch hands appeared slowly from the barn, Mexican workers with sun-darkened faces and quiet, steady movements. A black man stood near the corral, tall, older, watching with patient intelligence rather than submission. Clara noticed immediately. So did the silence around them. The land was not just isolated. It was watched, judged, tolerated. One of the neighboring riders passed the fence line that afternoon. Didn't enter, just stared from a distance long enough to make his meaning clear. Elijah did not look at him, but his jaw tightened. Clarice sighed and understood that this ranch existed inside, a pressure that could snap at any moment. Inside the house, Elijah handed her ledgers. Old, worn, precise, not decorative, necessary. "I don't need permission to decide anything," she asked. "No," he answered simply. That single word unsettled her more than any restriction ever had, because freedom, when offered without expectation, felt unfamiliar, almost suspicious. Days passed. Then something unexpected began to happen. Clara stopped being watched like a guest and started being listened to. Like a voice that mattered, Elijah asked her opinion about cattle routes, about broken fencing patterns, about supply shortages he had ignored for years. Because survival had replaced planning, he did not interrupt her, did not correct her, did not treat her ideas like decoration. One evening he caught him standing outside the barn, reading one of the books she had brought from Red Hollow. A simple novel, 1 pages, nothing important to anyone but her. "You read?" she asked, surprised. Elijah closed it slowly, not much. "Then why? Because you do." That answer stayed with her longer than she expected. Not romance, not confession. Something more dangerous. Attention without demand. Trust without ownership. The wind changed shape in her mind without asking permission, and so did he. But the West never allowed peace to grow without testing its roots. One afternoon, dust rolls on the horizon. Too organized to be weather. Too deliberate to be natural. Men on horseback, not Elijah's. Clara stood at the porch as they approached the fence line. Their laughter sharp, their posture arrogant, in the way men carried when they believed the world belonged to them. By default, one of them called out, "Oh, you gone soft out here." A mother spat into the dirt here. "You hiring anything that walks up right now?" Elijah stepped out slowly. No rush, no fear, only control. But Clara saw something behind his eyes, tight. Something old, history, memories, conflict. The men didn't cross the fence. They didn't need to. Their words did enough damage. Individuals, it was aimed at order, at structure, at the idea that things could exist outside the violence. They understood. Clara felt it, then not fear for herself, but for what this place was trying to become. Later she found Samuel Reed near the corral, tightening a saddle strap with calm precision. "They always come?" she asked quietly. He nodded once. "When they think something doesn't belong where it stands?" Clara looked toward the horizon where the riders had disappeared. "And do we belong here?" she asked. Samuel didn't answer immediately. "Then we stay long enough, it becomes harder for them to say no." That night Elijah did not sleep. Clara found him outside near the fence line, staring into the dark desert, as if it might confess something you never talk about before. She said softly. He didn't turn. "That's because it doesn't stay in the past." Silence. Then finally, "I wore a uniform once," Elijah said. "Thought I was building order out here, turned out I was just learning how to follow commands I shouldn't have obeyed." Clara stayed quiet because she understood what he was not saying. "You regret it," she said. "I carry it," he corrected. A pause, then quieter. There were camps, tribes, families who didn't speak my language and didn't need to die for it. His voice tightened but did not break. "I told myself I had no choice. Men always say that when they want to sleep at night." Claire stepped closer, not touching him, but close enough that the space between them stopped feeling like distance. "And now?" she asked, a long silence. Then Elijah finally looked at her for the first time. He said, "I'm trying to live like I do have a choice." Something shifted in Clara's chest. Not softness, not surrender. Understanding, because she, too, had been living in the aftermath of choices made by others. The wind moved through the ranch, low and patient, carrying the sound of horses shifting in the dark. Days turned into weeks, and slowly the house stopped feeling like a place she was visiting. It became something else, a rhythm. Coffee before sunrise, ink on ledgers, dust on boots, quiet conversations that did not need to be finished to matter. One morning Elijah found her repairing a broken fence section herself. Sleeves rolled, hair tied back. Refusing help, he didn't stop her, just stood nearby watching. Not in possession, in respect. "You don't have to prove anything here," he said eventually. Clara didn't look at him. "I'm not proving, I'm existing." A faint pause, then softer. "That's harder than most men in this valley can do." That made her almost smile. Almost. That evening the sky burned orange across the mountains, and the ranch fell into a rare kind of stillness. Elijah brought coffee to the porch. Didn't sit at first, just stood beside her. Then without warning, not dramatic, not rehearsed, he spoke. "I don't know how to offer things properly," he said. Claire glanced at him. He continued, voice steady, but carrying something fragile beneath it. "I built this place to survive alone. Thought that was enough." A pause. "Then it isn't." The wind moved between them. Elijah toned slightly, told her, "I don't want you here because I hired you," he said, "or because you have nowhere else to go." Another pause, his voice lowered. "I want you here because when you're in this place, it feels like it belongs to someone living in it again." Cleo's breath caught, not sharply, but like something inside her forgot its rhythm. Elijah reached into his coat. Not a gun, not a contract, a simple ring. "What unpolished human made? I'm not asking because you need saving," he said. A long silence stretched between them. "I don't know how to believe that yet," she said honestly. "You lie or not at once." "That's enough," he replied. "I can wait for the rest." The sun sank behind the mountains, turning the ranch into shadow and gold, and in that quiet, something fragile and real took its first breath. Not love, declared love, beginning to learn how to exist. The wind carried across the ranch as night settled in, soft and unhurried, like the wind itself was learning a new language. And for the first time in a long time, Clara Whitmore did not feel buried. She felt safe. A church bell rang once in the distance, thin, uncertain, swallowed almost immediately by the desert wind, as if even faith itself hesitated to witness what was about to be promised. And in the shadow of that silence, a woman who had once been discarded by an entire town was about to be called something new. If you're new here, subscribe to the channel and tap the bell icon. Stories like this deserve to be remembered. The wedding took place in a place that Red Hollow pretended did not matter. Not the town square, not the saloon, but a small stretch of land behind Elijah Boone's ranch house, where the earth was uneven and honest, and the sky felt too large for judgment. A traveling preacher stood beneath a makeshift wooden arch. Ranch workers gathered quietly, Mexican hands with dust-stained hats. Samuel Reed standing tall and still, like a witness carved from history itself. And a few wandering souls the town had long decided were disposable. There were no grand speeches, no polished chairs, no celebration from the town that once called Clara Whitmore too old for love, because the town was not invited, and neither was its cruelty. Clara stood in a simple dress, her hands steady but her breath measured, like a woman standing at the edge of a life. She no longer trusted to hold her safely. Elijah Boone stood across from her, still as stone, but his eyes, those were not stone. They carried everything he had never learned how to say. When the preacher began, the wind softened as if even the desert wanted to listen. Clara did not look at the sky, she looked at Elijah. Because this was not salvation. It was choice, and for once, no one was choosing for her. The words were spoken simple, heavy binding in ways neither of them fully understood yet. And when it ended, there was no applause. Only breath, only existence continuing. Elijah did something unexpected then. He did not announce her, did not present her. He simply reached for her hand. Not possessive, not performative, just steady. And Clara, after a long silence that felt like every year of her life, pressing against her ribs, allowed it. The ranch workers did not cheer, they nodded, as if something long overdue had finally settled into place. And for Clara Whitmore, that was more than celebration, that was recognition. If the first days of marriage were expected to feel like romance, Red Hollow had misjudged what survival actually looked like. It was not soft, it was not loud, it was work. Clara woke before sunrise, and learned the ranch the way a cartographer learns land, by damage pattern and necessity. She studied accounts Elijah had ignored for years, found leaks in supply chains, corrected broken trade routes that had cost him silently for seasons. Men who once assumed she was decoration began realizing she was structure, and structure changes everything. One morning a ranch hand hesitated before handing her a ledger. "Mr. Boone said you to decide on shipments now," he said awkwardly. Clara did not smile. She simply replied, "Then tell him I already have." That was the first time the ranch stopped seeing her as guest and started seeing her as authority. But authority in the West is never allowed to grow without resistance. In Red Hollow, whispers began like smoke. She married him too fast. He should have chosen younger. She trapped him with pity. Clara heard none of it directly. She did not need to. The wind carried it anyway. And some wounds do not require words to reopen. Elijah noticed the shift before she spoke of it. One evening he found her standing alone near the corral, staring at distant hills that did not care what names people carried. "They're talking," he said quietly. Cleo did not talk. They always do a pause. Then Elijah lower, "It doesn't change anything." Cleo's voice was calm but not untouched. "It changes how long it takes before I stop hearing them." Inside my own head, that silence between them was heavier than arguing, because neither of them were pretending anymore. Not about the world, not about themselves. Then one pipe wiped in the story of something inevitable. Not loud at first, not dramatic, just a present. A cowboy on with clean boots and dirty hands. The kind of man who never needed to draw a weapon, because others always did it for him. He visited Elijah's way twice. Did not dismount immediately. Just absorbed, measured, judged. "You're building something fragile like your pipe. Fragile things don't survive the West." Elijah stood near the front door. "They're fucking killed. What survives, Elijah will walk. Isn't always what deserves to." That answer is a little longer than Pipe's visit. Because men like Pipe did not accept more visit. They respond to it after that pressure became quiet. Upon delivery too late, prices shifted. Wage contracts questioned, not openly attacked, just screwed. Easily it could be owned. Clara tracked every change. She did not panic, but she did notice something else. Elijah's silence grew heavier. Not absence, containment, like something inside him was being forced into smaller and smaller spaces. One night, Clara saw him outside the house again, standing still watching nothing. "You're thinking about war," she said softly. Elijah didn't deny it. "I'm thinking about what I used to be good at," he replied. Clara stepped closer. "That's not the same thing." A pause. Then Elijah, quieter than before.
"It is when peace starts to feel like something I don't deserve."
That was the truth he carried. Not violence itself, but fear of returning to it. Pike's men came again weeks later. Not as visitors, as pressure. 3 riders this time. They circled the fence line slowly, laughing in ways that didn't require joy. One of them called out Boone. "Still letting your wife run your books." Clara stood on the porch. Did not move, did not retreat. Elijah stepped forward but stopped himself before crossing the boundary. That hesitation cost him something internally. Clara saw it, and so did the men outside, because they understood hesitation differently as weakness. Later when they left, silence filled the ranch like dust settling after impact. Clara turned to Elijah. "You almost became someone else out there," she said. Elijah's jaw tightened. "I was trying not to." "That's not the same thing," she repeated softly. And for the first time, Elijah had no answer. Then came the story they could not ignore. Samuel Reed did not return from town one night. At first no one spoke of it. Then a rider arrived at dusk, not from Pike, but carrying the weight of his message anyway. "He was found near the river road," she said quietly. "Beaten, left alone terribly." Clara felt the words before she understood them. Elijah did not move immediately, because men like him understand signals better than explanations. This was not an accident, it was instruction. A message written in violence. Clara stepped forward. "Who?" she asked. The wilder hesitated. Then the pipes met. The wrench did not work. Elijah turned toward the horizon. And for the first time in this section of their lives, Clara saw the scout again. Not the rancher, not the husband, but the man the West had trained through fire and war, and she understood something terrifying. Peace was not something Elijah Boone had learned to keep. It was something he was still fighting himself not to destroy. The wind rose that night in Red Hollow. Far beyond the ranch did not yet know what it had just awakened. A burned horizon stretched over the ranch, like a warning that the land itself had begun to remember every violence ever committed upon it. And this time it refused to forget. If you're new here, subscribe to the channel and tap the bell icon. Stories like this deserve to be remembered. The morning after Samuel Reed was taken, the ranch did not wake up. It hesitated. Horses shifted uneasily in their pens. Wind moved through broken fence lines, like something searching for weakness. Even the sunlight felt thinner, as if it had been stripped of warmth before reaching the ground. Clara Whitmore stood at the porch, watching Elijah Boone repair a broken gate in silence. Neither of them had slept. Not truly, because sleep after violence was never rest. It was rehearsal. Clara spoke first, voice steady but sharpened by exhaustion. "We go to the law." Elijah didn't look up. "There is no law here, only distance." "Then we create pressure," she insisted. "Writs, witnesses, railroad offices." He finally stopped working. Slowly turned, and Clara saw it. Not disagreement, but fatigue. "Deeper than argument, Clara," he said quietly. "Men like Pike are the law in places like this. They just don't wear uniforms." That silence between them was no longer peaceful. It was thinning like ice under weight. That night, the desert refused calm. Elijah sat alone by the campfire behind the ranch. Hat resting beside him, face half lit by flame and shadow. The fire cracked softly like bones. Remembering impact, Clara found him there. She did not speak immediately. She simply sat down opposite him and waited. The wind carried heat from the dying day, mixing with smoke and dust until even silence felt layered. Elijah finally spoke without looking at her. "I used to think I knew what orders were for," he said. Clara stayed still. He continued, "Cavalry days, northern campaigns. We were told it was order versus chaos." A pause. "It never looked like that up close." The fire shifted. "I remember a village," he said quietly. "Not one you'd find on maps. People respect they didn't speak our language. They didn't need to die for it." His hands tightened slightly. Clara did not interrupt because she understood something instinctively. Now this was not confession for relief. It was confession because silence had become unbearable. Elijah's voice lowered. "I told myself I tried to stop it." A bitter breath, but I still followed. Still rode in. Still stood there while it happened. The fire snapped sharply, "And now I wake up," he said. "And I can still hear things that aren't there." Clara's voice, when it came, was not soft, it was controlled. "What you're describing has a name." Elijah finally looked at her, and for the first time since he had known him, he looked not like a rancher, but like a man afraid of his own memory. Clara continued, "It does not erase responsibility that landed between them, like a stone dropped into water." Elijah did not deny it. That was the difference. He nodded. "Once I don't want forgiveness." He said, "I don't think I deserve even the idea of it." Clara's eyes tightened slightly. "That is not yours to decide alone." Silence followed, not peace, not reconciliation. Something heavier, truth without resolution. Days later, Pike returned. Not physically at first, but through consequence. Livestock began disappearing from neighboring ranches. Smoke rose from distant properties like quiet punctuation. Men arrived at fences, speaking in warnings disguised as conversation. "Land changes hands fast out here," one said. Another added almost casually, "Depends who survives holding it." Clara saw it clearly now. This was not pressure. It was preparation war disguised as inevitability. Then came the fire. It started at the fall. Grazing fields where dry grass met forgotten wind. Clara saw the glow first, not orange, not beautiful warm. She ran before she understood she was running. By the time Elijah reached the field, part of the ranch was already collapsing into itself. Barn edges burning, livestock scattering in panic. Night turning violent under flame. Men on horseback vanished into smoke. Pike's men, no doubt, now only confirmation. Clara entered the burning barn without hesitation. Elijah's voice cut through chaos, but she was already inside. He pressed against her like a living thing. Wood screamed as it collapsed inward. Smoke swallowed shape and direction. A beam shifted above her. She moved too late. It fell, and then bombs. Elijah pulled her out, through collapsing fire, dragging her into cold night air. As the bomb behind him folded into itself like something dying, she coughed violently, ash coating her throat. Vision blurred, but she was alive barely. Elijah didn't release her immediately. His grip was too tight, too human, too afraid. Then he saw it. One of Pike's men had not escaped. Pinned near the fire's edge, still alive, screaming. Something inside of I just snapped. Not loudly, quietly, then violently he moved. Clara saw it happen in fragments. Elijah crossing distance too fast for exhaustion. The man shouting something. Pleading or cursing, it no longer mattered. Then fists, then impact. Again and again until even the sound stopped being human. Clara shouted his name, but the wind took it. By the time she reached him, Elijah stood over the man who was no longer fighting. Not victorious, not satisfied, just empty. His hands trembled, not from anger anymore, from recognition of what he had become. In seconds, Clara stopped a few feet away. not because she was afraid of him, because she needed him to see her. Before he disappeared into that place completely. "Elijah," she said firmly. He didn't look up. "I didn't mean," he started, but stopped because that sentence was no longer honest. Clara stepped closer, and when she spoke again, her voice cut through smoke and ruin. "This is what they want," a pause. "Then if you become it, they win anyway." That finally reached him. Slowly Elijah looked at her, and what she saw was not rage anymore. It was horror at himself, at the edge he could still cross. At how close he had come, Claire didn't soften, not yet. "I will not build a life with a man I have to fear becoming." In order to survive, that struck deeper than accusation. It was boundary moral unmoving. Elijah lowered his hand slowly, as if realizing what they had done without permission given. "I'm trying," he said quietly. "I know," Clara answered, a beat then softer, but no less firm. "But trying is not enough if it keeps turning into blood." The ranch burned into dawn when the fire finally settled. Ash drifted over the land like memory, refusing to settle. Clara walked the perimeter alone at sunrise. Elijah was elsewhere, tending what remained, and she found a folded paper left near the broken fence line. Not accidental, delivered. Pike's signature was not written in ink. It was written in intention, plans, routes, names of ranches marked in sequence, a map not of land of control. Clara's hands tightened as she read. This was not a feud. It was expansion, systematic, cold, elimination by pressure fire, feel, and hunger. She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again, because grief in places like this was a luxury. She turned back toward the ranch where Elijah stood in the distance, watching what remained of their world. And Clara Whitmore understood something with absolute clarity. The valley was not being threatened, it was being scheduled. And survival would no longer be about endurance. It would be about choosing what kind of people they refused to become. While trying to stay alive, the wind moved through the ashes. And for the first time since the fire began, it did not feel like silence, it felt like warning. A valley once shaped by silence now learned a different language. Gunfire smoke and the trembling sound of men, realizing the land no longer belonged to peace. And when war finally arrived, it did not knock, it burned the door down. If you're new here, subscribe to the channel and tap the bell icon. Stories like this deserve to be remembered. The first attack came before sunrise. Not announced, not warned, just motion in the dark. Horses without riders screaming through the edge of the ranch line. Fences cut clean and a barn set alight. Like someone had decided the night itself should suffer. Elijah Boone stood in the ash light before Clara even reached him. He didn't speak at first because speech belonged to a world that was still intact. That world was gone. Clara stepped beside him, eyes fixed on the horizon, where distant flames marked other ranches already falling. "It's spreading," she said quietly. Elijah nodded once, not surprise. Confirmation Warren Pike had stopped pretending this was business. Now it was control. By midday, the valley had fractured into something new. Ranchers who once competed over cattle now gathered in broken clusters. Mexican laborers, black ranch hands, widows with rifles they barely knew how to hold, and settlers who had finally run out of places to be unwanted. Elijah did not call it an army. Clara did not call it hope, but it became both anyway. Samuel Reed, still recovering from earlier brutality, stood despite his injuries, refusing to leave the field. "You don't have to do this," Clara told him once. Samuel adjusted his bandage with quiet dignity. "In this land," he said, "if you don't stand somewhere, you get buried everywhere." That was all the agreement needed. The war did not move in lines. It moved in moments, a stagecoach ambushed near the dry riverbed, gunfire echoing through canyon walls. Like the land itself was breaking apart. A ranch house burned while a family escaped through back fields, guided by Clara's voice cutting through smoke. Elijah fighting not with rage now, but with control sharpened by consequence. Every shot measured, every movement restrained. Because he understood now, if he lost himself again, Pike didn't have to win. Clara became something the valley had not expected. Not symbol, not victim. Something harder, she carried ammunition through burning ground. When others hesitated, she negotiated safe passage with armed men, who recognized that her voice did not shake. And once at the edge of a collapsed homestead, she saw a gunman aiming at Samuel's wife. There was no time for thought. Only decision. The shot ended it. Silence followed, not peace, shock. Clara stood still after it happened. Hands lowered, breathing uneven. Not from fear, but from understanding what had just changed inside her. She did not speak for a long time afterward, because some versions of yourself do not ask permission before they arrive. Elijah found her that night near the fence line, The sky above them was fractured with smoke, stars struggling through like distant witnesses. "You did what you had to," he said. Clara didn't look at him, refusing to let it repeat itself, not rage purpose. Pike retreated toward the rail platform structure, pulling Elijah into the center of what became a brutal, hand-to-hand collapse of two men, shaped by different versions of the same land. No spectators mattered now, only impact. Fists, weight, struggle. Above them, the sky burned orange with distant fires still unresolved. At the same time, Clara led civilians through the burning stables behind the depot, timber collapsing, horses panicking, smoke thick enough to erase distance. "Keep moving," she shouted. Voice cutting through panic, a child stumbled. She grabbed them without hesitation, lifting them through debris. No hesitation now, no doubt. Only survival coordinated into leadership. Inside the depot, Elijah and Pike collided again. Pike, breath sharp, voice still arrogant even in collapse. "You think this changes anything?" he spat. "There will always be another man like me." Elijah's answer came quieter. "Then I'll be standing in front of him too." A final strike. Pike fell. Not theatrically, just finished. The West did not pause to acknowledge endings. It simply continued. Outside, Samuel Reed was already moving civilians towards safety when it happened. The shot was not dramatic. It was final. Samuel staggered first, confused more than afraid. Then he fell to one knee. Elijah reached him too late. Samuel looked up at him once. Not fear, not regret, only recognition. "You got it to stand," Samuel said quietly. "Don't let it fall back into him." Elijah froze because that was not advice. That was inheritance. Samuel exhaled once more. Then the valley lost him. Silence followed the battle in a way no victory ever deserves. Clara found Elijah near the rail line afterward. Neither spoke immediately, because words felt too small for what had been taken. The depot still smoldered behind them, smoke drifting upward like prayers that no longer expected answers. Clara finally said, "It didn't feel like winning." Elijah nodded. "It wasn't," he replied. A pause, then quieter. It was surviving long enough to decide what comes next. Clara toured the valley where firelight still marked broken ground, and she understood something simple and devastating. Freedom here was not arrival, it was cost, and it would always require payment. The wind moved through the valley as dusk approached, carrying ash heat and the distant echo of lives no longer present. But beneath that sky-scarred, unwilling, still standing, two people remained, not saved, not finished, but no longer alone. A valley that once screamed with fire had learned slowly and painfully how to breathe again, not healed, not forgiven, just continuing. And in the West, that was often the closest thing to peace. If you're new here, subscribe to the channel and tap the bell icon. Stories like this deserve to be remembered. Months had passed since the rail depot burned into memory. Instead of sight, now ash had settled into soil. Grass had begun to return in thin, stubborn patches, across land that remembered too much violence to ever forget. It completely burned ranches stood, rebuilt in parts, half repaired in others, like the valley itself, had decided survival was more honest than perfection. And at the center of it all stood Elijah Boone's ranch, not untouched. Not untouched at all, but standing. That alone made it different. Clara Whitmore walked through the morning light, with a ledger tucked under her arm, and dust on her boots that no longer belonged to shame. The ranch no longer watched her like a curiosity, it listened. Women came now, some with children, some with broken pasts, some with nothing but the courage to start again. They did not whisper about her age anymore. They asked her questions. How do you keep accounts balanced in drought season? How do you treat a fever when the doctor is days away? How do you keep going when everything says you shouldn't? Clara never answered with certainty, only with experience. Because certainty belonged to men like Pike. Survival belonged to people like her. She had built something without naming it at first. A school beneath a shaded awning near the barn. A small medical station filled with herbs. Bandages and knowledge passed from necessity rather than books. Children learned letters beside horses. Learning patience, and in that strange quiet, the ranch stopped being just land. It became shelter. Elijah Boone worked the fences alone most mornings. Not because he was isolated, but because he needed the repetition, hammer, wood, wire, something that obeyed rules he could understand. But even repair could not silence memory. Sometimes he stopped mid-motion, hand hovering over broken wood, seeing things that were not there anymore, not ghosts, just echoes. Clara never rushed him out of those moments. She had learned that healing was not interruption. It was patience. One morning, she approached him while he walked near the eastern fence line. The wind moved gently through dry grass, carrying the smell of distant rain that never quite arrived. "You didn't sleep," she said softly. Elijah didn't deny it. "I don't do that the way I used to," he replied. Clara stepped closer, watching him tighten wire with careful hands. "The past still speaks to you," she said. "It doesn't speak," he corrected quietly. "It were beads," a pause, then Cleo softer, "and you still answer it." Elijah finally looked at her. "No," he said. Not like before, that answer mattered more than perfection. At night the ranch changed again, not into field but into weather. Winter light flickered against wooden walls. Laughter, quiet, uncertain at first, then real, began to return among walkers who had once only spoken in survival terms. The valley, though scarred, was learning sound again. And sometimes when the fire burned low enough, Elijah and Clara would sit outside without speaking at all, because silence, once dangerous, had become shared. One evening, beneath a sky stretched wide and endless, Clara finally spoke, what had lived inside her longer than she had admitted. "I used to think my life ended before it began," she said. Elijah turned slightly toward her, but didn't interrupt. Claire's eyes stayed on the horizon. "Back in Red Hollow, I thought I was something finished, something the world had already decided," on a pause. Her voice did not shake, but it carried weight. "I believed I had missed everything that mattered." Elijah stayed quiet for a long moment. Then carefully, like someone placing truth down without breaking it. "You weren't missed," he said. "You were surrounded by people who didn't know how to see." Claire finally looked at him. Wind moved between them, soft, unhallowed. "And you?" she asked quietly. "Do you see me now, or am I just part of what you're trying to fix?" That question was not accusation. It was fear in its most honest form. Elijah didn't answer quickly, because answers like that cannot be washed without becoming lies. Then he said, "You are not what I'm fixing." A pause. "You are what I'm trying to deserve standing beside." Something in Kyle was softened, not into weakness, but into recognition of sincerity born through damage. Time did not erase scars, it simply made them part of the landscape. The valley's children played near repaired fences. Women who once were wild broken now live with work knowledge and place. Men who had survived the war world slowly. That protection did not always require violence. And Cleo became something no one in Red Hollow had ever. Not exception, not victim, not legend. Simply necessary. Elijah's nights grew quieter. Not because memory disappeared, but because it stopped commanding him. Clarence noticed the change in small ways. The way he paused before reacting. The way he breathed before speaking. The way he no longer reached first for anger. Healing, she realized, did not erase what he had been. It taught him how not to become it again. One evening, when the sky turned the color of burned gold, and the wind moved gently through the valley like an old hymn, Clara and Elijah stood near the porch of the ranch house. No urgency, no crisis, only time passing without demand. Clara leaned lightly against the wooden post. "I spent so long thinking I was behind everything," she said quietly. Elijah glanced at her. "And now?" he asked. Clara looked out at the land, at what had been rebuilt, at what had survived. "I think I was just not seen by the right kind of eyes." Elijah didn't respond immediately, then softly, "You are now." A silence followed, not empty but full, not dramatic, just true. That night firelight gathered around the ranch once more. Workers shared food, children laughed in uneven rhythms. Horses moved calmly in pens that no longer felt like confinement. And Clara sat on the porch steps writing letters, records of lives being rebuilt, names being remembered, futures being written slowly instead of taken quickly. Elijah worked nearby, repairing a final broken section of fence. Not alone, just present, and somewhere between the sound of wood, wind, and distant life returning, Clara realized something she had never been taught. In Red Hollow, survival was not the end of a story. It was only the beginning of learning how to live inside it. She closed her ledger gently, looked at the land one last time. As the sun began to fall behind the mountains, and in that quiet she understood she had not been too old for love. She had only been too long, surrounded by people who mistook endurance for emptiness. The wind moved through the valley, like a promise that did not need to be spoken aloud, and for the first time in her life, Clara Whitmore did not feel like she had survived her story. She felt like she was finally living it. That was my story if it reached you. Tell me what you felt. Don't let silence bury us again. Drop your thoughts in the comments. And tell me where in the world you're listening from. That was my story if it reached you. Tell me what you felt. Don't let silence bury us again. Drop your thoughts in the comments. And tell me where in the world you're listening from.